Imagine this. You are standing before a grand obsidian door, heavy and featureless. Behind it lies everything you have ever truly desired. The sharp clarity of purpose, the unshakable inner peace, the deep, resonant satisfaction of a life fully lived. You know instinctively that the key to this door is discipline. Yet, every time you reach for the handle, your hand retreats, guided by an invisible yet irresistible current. You have read the books, watched the motivational talks, set the alarms, and drawn up the elaborate spreadsheets. You understand the logic of consistent effort. You know that to build the statue, you must suffer the hammer and the chisel. You acknowledge that every towering monument to human achievement, whether a symphony, a philosophical treatise, a revolutionary business, or a sculpted physique, was forged not in a sudden flash of inspiration, but in the slow, agonizing heat of relentless, day-by-day effort. So, why the paralysis? Why does the internal resistance feel less like a minor obstacle and more like a metaphysical law of nature, an unseen iron gravity pulling you back toward the soft, dim ease of distraction and procrastination? You are an intelligent, capable human being. You can master complex professional skills, navigate intricate social dynamics, and process a vast amount of information. Why then are you perpetually failing at the one thing that truly belongs to you, the mastery of your own will? This is the great silent question that haunts the ambitious soul. Why do we crave freedom, yet cling to the chains of our own indiscipline? The common answer, the shallow, surface-level bromide, is that you are simply weak, that you lack grit or hustle. This answer is not only cruel, it is utterly insufficient. It treats the symptom and ignores the vast, churning, hidden machinery of the psyche. What if the reason you avoid discipline has nothing to do with weakness? What if your aversion to rigorous, sustained effort is, in fact, a deeply intelligent, albeit misguided, defense mechanism? A brilliant psychological strategy employed by a part of you that is trying to protect you from a profound existential threat? Consider the paradox. Discipline, as it is conventionally taught, is often framed as an act of self-conquest. You, the conscious ego, ruthlessly beating the lazy, chaotic self into submission. It is the victory of the accountant over the artist, the soldier over the dreamer. In this framework, discipline feels like a slow, deliberate form of self-murder, a forced narrowing of your infinite potential into a single, sterile, pre-approved track. Every step of forced compliance feels like a withdrawal from your authentic, complex, messy, and fundamentally free self. And this is where the genius of the deeper self rebels. The unconscious, the vast repository of your unlived life and untamed potential, perceives this brand of discipline not as liberation, but as a rigid cage, a psychic straitjacket designed to make you predictable, functional, and small. It sees the sacrifice of spontaneity, the culling of wild urges, and the rejection of shadow elements, all in the name of becoming a socially palatable, neatly packaged commodity. This is the central lie we are told about discipline, that it is the opposite of freedom. We are taught that to be disciplined means to limit your life, to constrain your options, to obey an externally imposed structure. But what if the inverse is true? What if the life you are currently living, the life of reactive distraction, scattered energy, and perpetual starting over, is the true cage? The resistance you feel is not laziness. It is the powerful, almost sacred defense of your psyche against a life of inauthentic obedience. But in its crude, automatic rebellion, your deeper self throws the baby out with the bathwater, confusing true, sovereign discipline with arbitrary, imposed restriction. You seek to avoid the pain of self-control, only to find yourself trapped in the far greater, slower agony of regret and wasted potential. The real question, the one that can dissolve all resistance, is this: what if the discipline you are avoiding is not the tool of your oppression, but the very mechanism of your deepest and most terrifying liberation? To understand this, we must stop looking at discipline as a chore and start viewing it through the lens of psychology's deepest pioneer. We must unearth the hidden psychological bargain you are currently making, a silent, self-sabotaging contract drawn up by your unconscious. And to do that, we must descend into the primal structures of the mind, where Carl Jung found the roots of all human conflict. We stand, then, at the threshold of a great realization. The aversion to discipline is not a moral failure, but a profound psychological mistake, a defense mechanism gone awry. To understand this deeper mechanism, we must look beyond the surface of willpower and descend into the psychological strata mapped by Carl Jung. Jung's entire philosophical project was built upon the necessity of integration, the arduous, lifelong process he called individuation. For Jung, the root of all modern neurosis and existential angst is the failure to properly integrate the unconscious elements of the psyche, most notably the shadow. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is not merely the evil part of you. It is the repository of everything you consciously reject about yourself. The raw, chaotic energy, the unacceptable desires, the feelings of rage, lust, envy, and laziness, and crucially, the unlived life. All the potentials and gifts that your ego, influenced by family and society, deemed too dangerous or inconvenient to express. Now, consider what conventional, shallow discipline demands of you. It demands a hyper-focused, rigid ego, the conscious self, to be constantly vigilant, suppressing and denying the very energies contained in the shadow. It demands you become a streamlined, rational machine, discarding the messy, irrational, emotional parts of your nature. This is the act of psychological splitting. The ego declares war on the shadow. When you try to force yourself into a routine that feels sterile, suffocating, or arbitrarily imposed, when you discipline yourself to pursue a goal that isn't truly aligned with your deepest, most complex desires, your shadow rebels. It uses its most potent weapons: procrastination, self-sabotage, and distraction. This resistance is the unconscious saying, "If you're going to amputate me from your life, I will destroy your structure first." The fatigue, the sudden urge to scroll, the mental block. These are not signs of laziness. They are the desperate, loud protests of a neglected soul seeking balance. Philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche understood this struggle for self-mastery not as a fight against weakness, but as a perpetual self-overcoming. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power is often misunderstood as merely a drive for dominance over others. More fundamentally, it is the drive for self-mastery and the continuous creation of values. When Nietzsche speaks of becoming who you are, he is imploring you to embrace the entire spectrum of your nature, including the Dionysian, chaotic, and irrational forces that discipline tries to suppress. If your discipline is a rejection of your own power, if it's simply a form of conformist obedience, it will be overthrown. Only discipline that serves the elevation and complete actualization of your true self, your will, can endure. This ties back to the psychological concept of the inner judge, or the superego, in Freudian terms, though relevant here. Much of what we call discipline is not driven by sovereign choice, but by a crippling fear of the inner judge's condemnation, the fear of not being good enough, not being successful enough, or not meeting an external standard. This is the difference between discipline and obedience. Discipline born from obedience is inherently fragile. It relies on external pressure or internal self-loathing. It is a house built on sand, because the moment the pressure is released, the repressed shadow erupts and takes revenge. This explains why you often see highly disciplined people suddenly crash into a wall of burnout, moral hypocrisy, or intense self-sabotage. Their discipline was a psychological tyranny, a refusal to deal with the messy, complex truth of their nature. They used willpower to wallpaper over their neuroses, only to find the shadow had been quietly drilling holes in the foundation. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist who survived the Holocaust, argued that humans are primarily driven by a will to meaning. Our discipline, our capacity for suffering and focused effort is directly proportional to our conviction in the meaning of our goal. Frankl observed that those who survived the camps were not necessarily the physically strongest, but those who possessed a deep, non-negotiable why. The hidden problem, then, is this. You are attempting to apply the mechanism of discipline to a goal that your deeper, more meaningful self does not truly sanction. You are using self-tyranny, false discipline, to pursue external validation or a hollow ideal, and your shadow, your unconscious guardian of authenticity, recognizes the fraud. It knows that true life, true growth, and true meaning require not the suppression of your chaotic energies, but their direction. The reason you never avoid discipline again, once you grasp this Jungian truth, is that you stop seeing it as punishment and begin to recognize it as the highest form of self-stewardship, the conscious, deliberate integration and channeling of your entire being, shadow and all, toward a purpose that burns so brightly it requires the immense, focused energy of your unified will. But what are the tangible consequences of failing this integration? What is the cost of the great psychological split? That is the unseen trap we must now explore. If the aversion to discipline is merely the shadow's rebellion against psychological tyranny, what are the actual, tangible, and unseen consequences of this internal civil war? The cost is far greater than missed deadlines or unfulfilled resolutions. It is the slow, silent erosion of your very sense of reality and self-worth. The first and most insidious consequence is the creation of the as-if personality. Because the true self, the totality of the integrated shadow and ego, cannot function under a regime of superficial discipline, the conscious mind constructs a facade. You begin to live as if you are the person who is about to start that project, or the person who will soon become disciplined. You collect the tools, read the books, plan the perfect routine, and engage in elaborate rituals of preparation. This is not preparation, it is psychic compensation. The energy that should be going into sustained action is diverted into creating a compelling illusion of action. This as-if existence is profoundly disorienting. It leads to what the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre termed bad faith, mauvaise foi. For Sartre, bad faith is the act of lying to oneself, of avoiding the terrifying burden of freedom and responsibility by pretending to be an object rather than a subject. When you postpone discipline, you are essentially declaring, I cannot act now because I am defined by my circumstances, or my future, disciplined self will fix this. You deny your radical freedom in the present moment, choosing the comfort of self-deception over the agonizing truth of choice. The unseen consequence is that you stop experiencing the world as a field of pure possibility and start experiencing it as a prison of predetermined excuses. Secondly, this constant internal warfare leads to a destructive feedback loop rooted in cognitive science, the attentional residue and erosion of trust. Every time you intend to focus on a difficult task, the task that requires discipline, and instead succumb to distraction, your brain incurs an attentional residue. You carry the mental weight of the abandoned intention, making the next attempt harder. More critically, the failure to follow through on commitments to yourself, even small ones, slowly but surely erodes self-trust. Self-trust is the bedrock of a stable identity. When the ego and shadow are fighting, the ego constantly breaks its promises to the shadow by trying to suppress it, and to the self by failing to execute the agreed-upon task. Every broken promise sends a subconscious signal. You cannot rely on yourself. This fundamental lack of self-trust is the reason anxiety and lack of discipline are so often intertwined. If you cannot trust your own will to manage your reality, the external world seems infinitely threatening and chaotic. You become dependent on external structure, external validation, and external motivation, trading your internal sovereignty for a feeling of temporary safety. Think of the societal manifestation of this as observed by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World. Huxley envisioned a society engineered for the avoidance of pain and the maximization of low-effort pleasure. This is the collective shadow's revenge. When the effort of meaningful discipline becomes too great, the psyche demands instant, effortless gratification, the soma of endless entertainment, passive consumption, and digital distraction. The unseen trap is that this constant seeking of ease in fact requires immense discipline to maintain. You must constantly discipline yourself to be distracted, to avoid uncomfortable truths, to ignore the pangs of guilt, and to drown out the quiet, persistent voice of your potential. You become highly disciplined in the pursuit of comfort and avoidance. The consequence is a life lived in a state of hypnotic regression, where genuine growth is sacrificed for the illusion of perpetual childhood ease. The ultimate price of this psychological splitting, of avoiding the true discipline Jung called for, is the forfeiture of the fullness of your experience. True discipline, the unified channeling of ego and shadow, is what allows you to hold difficult, complex realities and create something of genuine value. When you lack it, you only interact with the smooth, easy surfaces of life. You become an aesthetic consumer of experiences rather than a rugged creator of reality. The deep satisfaction, the telos, ultimate purpose, that comes from pushing against resistance is replaced by a shallow, frantic chasing of novelty. You are not living your life, you are merely monitoring its decline. This leads us to the critical turning point. How do we break free from this unseen trap and reclaim the discipline that actually liberates? The rebellion. How to break free. The realization that your indiscipline is the unintended byproduct of a psychological civil war, the shadow rebelling against the ego's tyranny, is the true start of the rebellion. The way out is not more willpower, but a radical shift in perspective that transcends the false dichotomy of work versus freedom. The rebellion against indiscipline begins with the counterintuitive act of integrating the shadow into your discipline. If your unconscious mind sabotages effort because it fears amputation, the solution is to make discipline the act of incorporation. This is the Jungian alchemy of turning lead into gold. 1. Renegotiate the purpose. From should to will. The vast majority of failed discipline is rooted in the word should. I should work out. I should write. I should save money. These are the echoes of the superego, the internalized standards of society or past authority figures. They hold no intrinsic energy. The first step is to discard all shoulds and replace them with the non-negotiable I will. But this will must be informed by your deepest, truest self. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of the will, posited that the will is the blind, relentless force underlying all reality. While he saw it as a source of suffering, for our purposes, we must tap into that force. You must ask the brutal, clarifying question: what is the deepest, most terrifying truth I am trying to manifest? And what is the discipline required to serve that truth? If your shadow demands rest, your discipline must integrate purposeful, scheduled rest. If your shadow craves chaos and spontaneity, your discipline must carve out blocks of wild time, unstructured time for creative exploration, not just consumption. If your shadow fears the rigidity of the task, the discipline must be framed as a ritual, a sacred, non-negotiable time dedicated to the growth of your highest self. This radical discipline is not against the self, it is for the self. It becomes an act of sovereignty, not obedience. 2. Embrace the inner tyrant's weapons. The power of containment. The shadow's main weapons against you are procrastination, distraction, and the allure of ease. Instead of fighting these impulses, you must learn to contain and channel them. Consider the historical example of the ancient Stoics, who were masters of self-mastery not through denial, but through structured exposure. They understood that the mind needs boundaries, not endless suppression. The procrastination. Paradox. Instead of forcing yourself to start the main task, discipline yourself to endure the feelings of procrastination. Set a timer for 10 minutes and simply sit with the urge to avoid the work. By observing the urge without acting on it, you separate your conscious self from the impulsive shadow. You gain mastery not over the task, but over your own emotional reaction to the task. The 5-minute commitment. When faced with a monumental project, you're not committing to the whole thing. You're committing to 5 minutes of focused, deliberate work. This is the psychological trick that bypasses the shadow's fear of endless toil. The shadow says, "I won't do that giant thing." The integrated self replies, "Fine. We will only do this tiny 5-minute thing." Once started, the momentum, known as the Zeigarnik effect, typically carries you forward. 3. The alchemical shift, from self-punishment to self-creation. Conventional discipline is powered by guilt. True rebellion is powered by the ecstatic energy of creation. When you fail a discipline, e.g., miss a workout or a writing session, the standard response is self-flagellation. The inner judge descends with condemnation. This only strengthens the shadow's resentment and ensures the next failure. The rebellious response is to recognize the failure as data, not destiny. You ask, what part of my psychological contract was violated? Did I fail to respect my need for rest? Was the goal not truly mine? Your discipline is not a measure of your worth. It is simply the vessel you use to pour your life's energy into your chosen form. If the vessel breaks, you don't destroy the energy, you fix the vessel. This radical shift changes the emotional landscape of effort. Discipline stops feeling like a sacrifice endured for a distant reward and starts feeling like the direct, tangible experience of creating your destiny. You are not avoiding discipline anymore because it is no longer the enemy. It is the crucible where your fragmented self is forged into a unified, powerful whole. This is the essence of true sovereignty, and it leads us directly to the final, most profound realization. We have journeyed through the external resistance, the psychological roots, the unseen consequences, and the radical perspective shift required to embrace discipline. Now, we arrive at the final, most profound truth, the realization that redefines the very nature of effort and struggle. The ultimate reason you will never avoid discipline again is that discipline is not a tool you use. It is the reality you inhabit. It is not an action you perform. It is the defining feature of consciousness itself. To be a conscious being is to live in a perpetual state of choice, and every choice requires a micro-act of discipline. The discipline to attend, the discipline to choose one thought over another, the discipline to withhold an immediate reaction. The truly indisciplined person is not simply one who fails to exercise. They are one who is not present in the fabric of their own reality. They are merely a collection of external stimuli and automatic reactions, a ship without a rudder, blown about by every unconscious impulse and societal current. The final revelation, rooted in a deep understanding of human nature, is this: the absence of sovereign, self-imposed discipline does not lead to freedom. It leads to the immediate, involuntary imposition of an inferior discipline. Think of it as a fundamental law of psychological physics. Energy must be ordered. If you do not consciously choose the structure, the universe, or, more accurately, your unexamined shadow, will choose it for you. If you lack the discipline to consciously manage your time, you will be disciplined by the arbitrary demands of your email inbox, your boss, or the algorithm that governs social media feeds. This is the discipline of reaction. If you lack the discipline to consciously select nourishing food and exercise, you will be disciplined by the slow, agonizing structure of chronic illness, fatigue, and diminishing vitality. This is the discipline of decline. If you lack the discipline to confront and process difficult emotions, you will be disciplined by anxiety, cycles of self-sabotage, and the rigid, suffocating structure of neurosis. This is the discipline of avoidance. The powerful, paradigm-shifting realization is that discipline is the cost of entry for agency. The price is paid one way or another. You are not choosing whether to be disciplined. You are only choosing whose discipline you will obey, your own or that of your lower impulses, and the external world. This insight reframes the entirety of the struggle. Discipline is not the jailer. It is the builder of the sovereign self. When Carl Jung spoke of individuation, he was not describing a mystical withdrawal from the world, but the forging of a fully integrated, self-determined personality capable of bearing the full weight of reality. True discipline is the daily ritual of integrating your shadow's energy, the powerful, raw will, and channeling it through the ego's structure, the conscious direction. This is why, once you fully grasp this, the avoidance ends. You stop running from discipline because you realize you are merely running from the conscious authorship of your own life. The pain of conscious effort, the sting of the chisel, is momentary and purposeful, leading to the creation of the self you admire. The pain of indiscipline, the slow, dull ache of regret and unfulfilled potential, is chronic, purposeless, and corrosive. The greatest truth is that discipline is the ultimate act of self-love. It is the acknowledgement that your future self deserves the effort of your present self. It is the realization that the deepest, most terrifying freedom is not the freedom from constraints, but the freedom to impose your own meaningful constraints, to choose your own burdens, to decide your own struggle, and thereby to become the creator of your own reality. When you sit down to the work, the resistance will still come, but you will now hear the shadows protest differently. It is no longer saying, "Don't do this. It's too hard." It is saying, "Don't forget about me. Make sure this effort is for a life truly worth living." And your unified sovereign response is simply to acknowledge the protest, integrate its raw energy, and continue sculpting the self you were meant to be. The decision has already been made. The reality is already set. The only path forward is to inhabit the powerful, disciplined truth of your own choosing.